You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt with Middle East Monitor. The book of Joshua is the sixth book of the Hebrew Bible and Old Testament, as well as the first book of the Deuteronomistic history, and it tells the story of the Israelite conquest of Canaan and goes up to the Babylonian exile. As a story, it is favored among modern Israeli leaders who have transformed the biblical text into a component of the Israeli occupation of Palestinians. But who is Joshua? What is the story? And why did it become a key text for Israeli leaders? Helping us to understand this is Rachel Havrelock. Rachel Havrelock is a professor of English at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where she is also director of the Freshwater Lab, focused on water protection as a means of political reconciliation and climate change adaptation. Rachel's latest book, The Joshua Generation, Israeli Occupation and the Bible, Princeton University Press 2020, tells the story of how the Bible became militarized, yet still holds lessons for de-escalation and cohabitation. While writing River Jordan, the mythology of a dividing line, University of Chicago Press 2011, she became involved in the environmental peace building with the Israeli-Palestinian Jordanian NGO Echo Peace Middle East. Rachel also researches and writes about oil pipelines and how to make the transition from fossil fuels. Rachel, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thanks so much for having me.
Indeed, and I wonder if we could sort of start right at the beginning before we sort of get into the book of Joshua. I mean, you're a professor of English literature, but you've done so many things that seems like it's outside of the realm of English, such as doing peace work in the Middle East and writing about the book of Joshua and its changing historical and political context. So what sort of drew you to doing all of this?
So yeah, just by way of my background, my PhD is actually in what was then called Near Eastern Studies, that we've now updated to Middle East Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, with a particular focus on the political interpretation of biblical texts. So I was very interested in how these ancient texts can be understood in their own context, but then how they are amplified, re-understood, and applied to modern political life. So that happens in a lot of spheres. It happens in literature, hence my affiliation in a department of English. It also happens in, a whole slew of popular culture, television, film, and the like. But it also, maybe most significantly, happens in contemporary political life. And, we've seen the nature of political interpretation really change in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. So that's where my research interests lie, and my initial dissertation work was on the Jordan River. And I was not quite interested in geography at the time, or the kind of, materiality. I was interested in border drawing and the way in which religious traditions either impact or influence or are ignored in the drawing of modern day borders. In the end, the book concludes they're mostly ignored, but, kind of marshaled to justify arbitrary border drawing. And it was about over a decade period of spending time and researching in the Jordan River Valley that I, watched a storied holy river disappear. And that, combined with the kind of coextant collapse of the coastal aquifer beneath Gaza, that changed the nature of my research, because there I was in real time watching sources of water dwindle and disappear. And for me, it sort of brought me out of the purely textual realm into these geographic questions. So there's a bit of the trajectory of how all of these things come together.
Indeed, indeed. And obviously, you wrote a book about that, and you've been active in this area for a while now. And in 2020, you wrote the Joshua generation, which I had to sort of tell myself not to say Samson generation for some reason. That word has just been stuck in my head.
I actually understand why. The kind of father of Israeli revisionism, Zev Jabotinsky, wrote a kind of very muscular, militarized book about Samson. So you're absolutely right. These are two kind of twin figures that have been marshaled in modern Israeli political life.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. And it's it's a very good book. It was surprising to me in some ways because I wasn't sure what to expect when I opened it up. And it was really interesting to me that the first half of the book is really focused on Joshua and his historic context, how it's regarded religiously over the generations. And then the second half deals a lot with how Israel transforms this, which we're going to go into today. But it was a really fascinating book in that regard. It felt very evenly balanced in its research. So you're giving as much time to the historic context as you are to Israel's adaptation of it. So that's my sort of reflection. But I think we should start right at the beginning. Before we sort of talk about the history of what we know about the book of Joshua, because obviously history is an important component. I wonder if you could just introduce us to who Joshua is and what's his story.
The biblical Joshua is probably, from a character point of view, one of the flattest characters in the entire Hebrew Bible. Joshua is the successor to Moses. So Moses, well, again, depending on your interpretation, either perishes east of the Jordan River or achieves a kind of immortality. These are a lot of debates around that. And Moses, the great visionary and leader of the liberation, does not cross the Jordan River and enter into this next stage that of biblical history. He appoints a successor to do so. So Joshua, who is the successor of Moses the prophet, is never named a prophet. In fact, he doesn't really have a title. He seems to act as what we would call a general once he is called the servant of God. And Joshua is a character whose purpose seems to be like pure execution. And that is the execution of conquest. Throughout the biblical books of Deuteronomy and others, it's very clear in this narrative the people of Israel are liberated from slavery. The generation that knew slavery does not want to enter an inhabited land. They call it a land that devours its inhabitants. And, I sort of see them as this kind of like peace generation that just says, like, we're liberated people. We don't want to engage in constant war. And they die out, and their children cross with Joshua. Joshua is only one of two of that generation that makes it in. And his character is very flat. So this idea of like, the pure execution of a plan folds into Joshua as a type. And it's rare for biblical texts because Moses has interiority, is a very vexed and compelling character. King David has all this complexity. I mean, this is not a literature that produces flat characters, but yet Joshua is one. And what we have in the book itself that's named after Joshua, it has a little bit of a lesser status in Jewish tradition. The 5 books of Moses, that's the core of the Torah that has a kind of an authority and influence. And, the section in which the book of Joshua appears has less authority, is not as central, but a biblical book all the same. And so the book itself narrates the first 12 chapters, this really gruesome ancient conquest allegedly an extermination of all the peoples who are there. But as I urge in the book, it's really important for readers to go to the second half of the book of Joshua. It doesn't have battles. It doesn't have the same drama of war. It's rather boring. It's about the allocation of territory and borders. And yet, when a reader moves on to that second half of the book of Joshua, there are many surprising conclusions. The core of which is the fact that all of the peoples allegedly exterminated in the first half of the book of Joshua are all still there. And so we see a very different depiction of ancient reality, which is not endless conquest and war and extermination, but rather a whole host of tribes and clans and groups who are living in the same land, overlapping, skirmish and war was very much a part of the ancient world as it is ours. So I'm not going to say it's like a beautiful utopia. There are contests over land and water and the like, but we see, this very complex overlapping place of really multiple peoples and multiple groups. And the figure of Joshua is still there in that section as well.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. And what do we know about the book of Joshua from a historic point of view? Because obviously, with the thing about the 5 books of Moses and the Torah, even the Bible generally, is obviously you have literary components. It's a very big influence on literature. You have moral, metaphysical components, but they are also, in their own kind of way, history books. They're telling a story, they're telling a history. Now, of course, trying to uncover whether Bible stories are actually true has proven to be a lot harder, and quite possibly many of them may not have occurred based on archaeological evidence. And there's also a lot of question marks over, who's authoring these biblical texts that we're reading, because it comes out of certain literatures written by rabbis and these traditions. So what do we know about the book of Joshua in this light?
Right. And let me just, qualify that I'm speaking here from a scholarly perspective. So, for people, it is rather an authoritative religious stance that these books were revealed. So I want to indicate my methodology so that, listeners to understand that for people who aren't, necessarily coming from a scholarly historical point of view, this is revealed and is the word of God. But again, I'm coming at it historically and from a scholarly point of view. And this scholarly point of view admits to the fact that, like all written language, there are authors here. And so we do know that the book of Joshua is part of what scholars call, so you're never going to open a Bible and find this word. This is a scholarly term, but it belongs to what scholars call, and they also debate it, the Deuteronomistic history. And these are a set of biblical books, exactly as you mentioned in your intro, that span from the book of Deuteronomy and Moses all the way to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians and the exile of the Judeans. And so it seems, and again, this is very debated by scholars, that these books of Deuteronomy are ultimately compiled and written by a set of scribes who are either working for the monarchy or are royalists themselves, right? This is a group that likes centralization and they like the monarchy. There are other groups that we can identify speaking in biblical texts. The book of Joshua, and here this is, really the outcome, this position is the outcome of my own studies. The book of Joshua is very unusual because it has this really centralizing voice, right? The tribes are unified under Joshua. They march as one people in an army. And again, the first 12 chapters, there's this portrait of like total opposition between these incoming tribes and everybody else in the land. But by paying closer attention to the texture, we see that like beneath this kind of plot line of centralization are all these very localized traditions. We hear about a social unit called the household. And we understand that in the ancient Near East, the household was the basis of the economy, right? It was the site of production and surplus. So, we hear all of this mention of different households. We hear all of these mentions of clans and tribes, and we have these regional, local, geographic traditions that, are right under this veneer of unity and nationalization. And so I really propose that, what I propose is, there was never this conquest. There were never these tribes. I mean, maybe one or two that marched in from elsewhere and, swept across the land in conquest. What you had is, what we see throughout the ancient Near East is a whole set of social groups, clans and tribes coming into consolidation and alliance. Importantly, military alliance, because this is the era of great empires, ancient Egypt and Assyria. And if you're, one little tribe in the hills and the empire comes through and you try to fight them with your militia, you're not going to win. So these empires exerted influence to start consolidating. So what I see in the book of Joshua is this process of trying to gather these groups in to a kind of confederation, a kind of an alliance, in order to face the task of fighting these empires. And this, I think, is in the biblical part of the book, is I think one of the most important conclusions, because for centuries, biblical readers have taken this like total opposition between Canaanites and the people of Israel is this absolute, like irreducible opposition and dichotomy. And what I see in the book of Joshua is this process of bringing groups into an alliance under, some kind of confederation or unified government, and also accepting their local traditions as part of the story. And so there's groups that join in. They end up being part of this tribal confederation, and there's groups that stay out. And so this like vehement hatred against other peoples in the book of Joshua, I argue, is the vehement hatred that people often harbor for their political opponents. So saying, right, we wiped them all out, but then admitting that they're still there, right? This is a kind of a political rhetoric against those tribes and clans and peoples that don't join this alliance. So, I mean, this is, I think, a big implication, because this has been taken as like an absolute dichotomy between monotheists and pagans. This has been taken as an ethnic difference, between Israelites and other peoples. So this is, the implications of this in world history are really, really significant. And I'm like, look, this was a political movement and a bunch of people didn't join. And so that hatred, is something that, for better or worse, we see in political debates of today.
So when you said Joshua is an unusual character in that he's very flat in the Bible, what is the sort of significance of him being flat for the audience that's reading it? I mean, what does this tell us about Joshua and what they mean to convey about him?
Yeah, it's a great question about the flatness of the character. In a certain way, Joshua is like a cookie cutter version of someone's ideally dream general, right? The battle plans, according to the book of Joshua, come from God. And Joshua doesn't, one of the famous descriptions of Joshua is that he doesn't veer to the left or to the right, right? He's this kind of straight ahead general. Again, according to the book, the battle plan comes from God. He executes it. He seems to have, no preferences. So it's the writers are really dreaming. Like if you could have the ideal general that didn't harbor any of his own aspirations or ambitions, right? That wasn't leaning one side or the other. And, but they get it something that they get it something else with Joshua, because Moses, I mean, no one has the stature of Moses, the lawgiver, the prophet, the liberator. And Moses does not go in to this bloody business described in the first half of Joshua, right? The prophet of the liberation does not end up, executing anything like that. So Joshua is also like the flatness of the character might well be a way of also like tempering, any kind of moral haunting about the actions that are narrated there, right? Because I think to produce, and again, it's very interesting, and literary scholars have made this point that, several biblical characters have this kind of interiority that we don't see in other literature of the ancient world, most of which is epic. It is epic. And the epic form doesn't give a lot of time for, what's going on in a character's thought. But I think to grant interiority to Joshua would be to dramatize a moral quandary about these commands of, and just to state, the verses that say it, right? These commands of like utter extermination and wiping out of a resident people.
That's actually raised a question in my head as you were speaking about the interiority, because as you sort of mentioned, in ancient literature, it tends to be epics, which don't really leave way for interiority of characters. Why do you think we have interiority for biblical characters? And really, how unusual is this for an ancient world?
It's completely unusual for the ancient world. Literary scholars of the Bible have, seen some of the first stirrings of the form of fiction. And there's a big question here, because the writers of the Hebrew Bible, they do invent prose narrative, right? It's not something that exists in the ancient world. The ancient world is, is the world of epics, whether those are the Ugaritic, Canaanite epics, or the Greek epics. So they come up with this form, and it's a great way to start any seminar. Like, why? Why do they come up with fiction? I suppose a simple answer, I don't find it totally satisfying, but that the same writers are trying to come up with new descriptions of the divine, right? This is also the emergence of the monotheistic idea. And so if you are conceiving a different description of God, you're not going to take up the same genre as people who are celebrating many gods. So many people say they come up with prose narrative for this reason, because they want to start moving towards thinking about a singular God. And they've posited that maybe prose narrative in and of itself enables this form of interiority, right? Maybe the nature of verse that is so focused on the form, and also, right, epic, I believe, definitely begins in oral traditions. It's in rhyme and in verse, so that the great storytellers could remember it and perform it at gatherings. And so maybe there's something about prose narrative, unconstrained by the form of verse, that lends itself to not only external descriptions, but getting at human interiority.
Indeed, indeed. And it's, I think a lot of English literature, you can see the origins through biblical narratives. I think it influences it quite greatly. I mean, English specifically, you have the King James Bible translation, which plays a huge role in the development of English literature. And if that was our subject today, we would be going into further detail on that.
Yeah,
But
we could have a great time on that, but
yeah, indeed, indeed. So I want to now take it to, because the way I've sort of phrased the question here is to talk about how the book of Joshua down the ages before we get to Zionism and modern Israel was received and understood and related to by Jewish communities and Christian. But I think we should split that up between Jewish and Christian because they're not necessarily going to have the same reaction. So for the Jewish community before Zionism, how is the book of Joshua? What's the significance of the book of Joshua? How do they receive it? What role does it play in their religious life?
So in the history of Judaism, which is largely a history of living in diaspora, the book of Joshua is probably one of, if not the most insignificant biblical book. And so, the kind of popularity of Joshua in Jewish interpretation and Jewish life, it really, rises and falls with questions of political sovereignty. So we have the biblical book. It's definitely an older book, I think from around the 8th century BCE. The book also comes into popularity during what we call the Second Temple period, right? This is like the second period of ancient Jewish sovereignty in the land. And so when you have a Jewish kingdom, this is following the uprising against the Greek Empire. There's this kind of like brief period. And so there's a lot of talk of Joshua, right? Having an army, this kind of unity. So that's like a kind of a moment when Joshua is talked about quite a bit in Jewish interpretation. Then we have in the 1st century CE, the Roman invasion, the destruction of the temple, the exile. And you have this product or, this process rather of adaptation, right? The Hebrew Bible is tied to the calendar, to the seasons in the Levant, right? It imagines pilgrimages to the temple. And so with the scattering of the people, the whole question is this whole thing going to fall apart? It doesn't end up falling apart. There is the project of adaptation. And, in many ways, this is the project of Judaism. And so the holidays of Judaism initially formed in relationship to agriculture and seasons. It all gets adapted to practices and laws and communal behaviors that can be performed anywhere. And this becomes rabbinic Judaism, right? This adaptation that the rabbis make into books in Judaism called the Talmud and the Midrash. It's a whole interpretive project, and it doesn't really end. The idea is interpretation keeps it ongoing. Well, Joshua becomes an embarrassment at this time, right? Beginning in like the 2nd century of the CE, all through all the way up to the 19th century. Why? Well, because now Jews are Jewish communities exist nested in countries that have other sovereignties. And so a book about a military conquest is not going to do anybody any good in this situation. And also the idea is that there's not going to be, uprising and conquest and return to the ancient land, right? There's going to be the project of practicing Judaism wherever people are in the world. So Joshua is an embarrassment. And the whole weight really leans towards Moses as a lawgiver, right? As the exemplar of, presenting law. And Joshua becomes a footnote in the readings in synagogues. The book of Joshua is hardly read. The book of Joshua was not studied, not really interpreted, and not thought about very much at all. Here and there, there'd be some kind of like apocalyptic movement that wanted to go back to the land, and they'd use Joshua as a template. But in mainstream Judaism, again, we're talking about like 2nd century to 19th century, the book was not really read, not really pondered, had very, very little importance. And it's the Christian understanding of the book of Joshua isn't incidental to that as well, because Christian readers take Joshua as a forerunner or a kind of precursor to Jesus, right? Their name is the same. Jesus's name is really Joshua in Hebrew. And so they see Joshua, someone who crosses the Jordan River, enters the promised land. They say, okay, Joshua, does these actions on earth that Jesus takes to a celestial level. He baptizes in the Jordan. He brings believers, right, to the promised land of the heavenly realm. So there's a very, very strong identification in Christian thought of Joshua and Jesus. And there's another reason, right, why Jewish interpreters just move away from the figure. So, between the identification with Jesus and the Christian theological realm and the kind of, plain meaning of the text promoting conquest and militarism, right, this just becomes a complete footnote in most of Jewish historical interpretation and Jewish life.
Indeed, it's but as we've sort of moving forward now into the sort of modern period, it does get rediscovered in a sense by Ben-Gurion, right? And in your book, you start talking about a study group that he sets up in his home, I believe, where, other people, particularly other ministers and others, come and they sort of debate these different books. And the book of Joshua emerges as a very interesting book to them, which, on the one hand, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about a world leader spending his time in a book reading club, but
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. But what is it about? So what happened during these circles? How did Joshua become a thing that they became interested in?
So yes, the book of Joshua, its revival is completely tied to the rise of a modern Zionist movement, right? Because suddenly, the whole question is like, what is this land and how do we understand it? And, the whole idea that sovereignty depends on war, right? The book of Joshua, and we'll get to Ben-Gurion's study group because that's what's really important. But as just starting in the late 19th century and through the whole period of the end of the Ottoman Empire and beginning of the British Mandate, when you do have Jews immigrating to Palestine and thinking we want to not only be residents here, but we want to establish, some communal political constellation here, it's quite disorienting. They're immigrants to a place that they know from prayers and texts. And so the book of Joshua, also because it has the second half has all these place names and all these descriptions of borders and mountains and springs. And so, for these early Jewish nationalists, they like come to the place and they use the book of Joshua almost like an atlas. Where are we and what should we call it? And Ben-Gurion, who becomes the first prime minister and minister of defense of the state of Israel, is among that group. And Ben-Gurion is a fascinating figure. He is, of course, a Zionist, a political nationalist. He's also a socialist, very, very secular, and also a really like voracious reader across religions. Like there's, somebody else one day could look at like Ben-Gurion and Buddhism. So, Ben-Gurion comes to the book of Joshua as a secular nationalist reader. And he starts taking it almost as like a template for how do you establish a Jewish army? Like, what do you call places, right? What does sovereignty look like? And there's two scenes before his study group that are really worthy of mention in this kind of, modern day rise of the book of Joshua, is that on the eve of statehood, when, the proto-Israeli government knows that a war is coming, Ben-Gurion has this ceremony where he creates the army. He tells everyone to throw off their diasporic names, to pick Hebrew names from the Hebrew Bible, preferably the book of Joshua. And he begins to create units of the Israeli army with the language of Joshua. And this might be the place, this anticipates what's coming, but this might be the place to say that in Hebrew, the word for the occupation itself, kibush, is a word derived from the act of Joshua's conquest. So like even in the word itself of modern day occupation, and that's kind of what brought me to this book, right, is that like the two become entangled in language. So Ben-Gurion creates what becomes the Israel Defense Forces, with this impetus from Joshua. And quite a few battles of the 1948 war are named after battles in the book of Joshua. The chief of staff in 1948, Yigael Yadin, comes up with some of his battle plans in reference to the biblical book. And Ben-Gurion infamously says in 1948, he says, there has never been a better interpreter, Gentile or Jewish, of the book of Joshua than our forces in this war. So Ben-Gurion literally casts the actions of the Israeli military, that had just come into being in 1948 as like an interpretation of this book. And so Ben-Gurion gets it in his mind that the project of modern Israel is like a reenactment of the book of Joshua. And he starts something which continues until today, and we'll talk about this, but he starts a process in which Israeli leaders identify, either directly or indirectly, identify with Joshua and present themselves as this modern day Joshua. And so Ben-Gurion does this in his own writings. He calls Theodor Herzl, this kind of early Zionist writer and activist, Moses, implying that he's Joshua. And as we can talk about after, this goes on and on and on, with the kind of militarism becoming increasingly more intense. So that's kind of the background on Ben-Gurion and Joshua, particularly in 1948. Jump ahead 10 years later, it's 1958. There have been 10 years of modern Israel. The Palestinians within the state at that time still do not have citizenship or rights in 1958. And the country is preparing for this celebration of 10 years of its existence. And Ben-Gurion looks around because in those 10 years, there was also a massive, massive project of immigration of millions of Jews from all over the world to modern Israel. And I mean, although they pulled it off, it was not without many strains and not without some pretty severe stratifications based on class and Jewish ethnicity, by which I mean Jews from Muslim countries in this absorption project received demonstrably worse treatments and benefits than those from the West and Christian countries. But okay, Israel has absorbed millions of people. You've got this kind of polity of Jews, and Ben-Gurion looks out and he says, okay, but what do we have in common? Right? We, Jews from all over the world have different ethnicities. They're all Jews, but they have different interpretations of the same religious practices. They speak different languages. He says, okay, their kids all go into the army, and this becomes a unifying force, but our society is, diverse and fragmented. So Ben-Gurion at this 10-year mark wants to give this young nation a narrative, a central narrative. And he searches for what it should be. And he decides that the unifying narrative is the book of Joshua. And there's one more layer to it, is the 1948 war cast in the language of Joshua. So, right, he wants to create a national narrative that he sees as unifying. And it can't entirely be the 1948 war on its own, because most of the immigrants didn't fight in that war. There are, throughout the 1950s, contested interpretations of that war and what should happen, in its wake. And so Ben-Gurion endeavors to forge this narrative in modern Hebrew. And he does so by calling an elite group of interpreters to his home, meeting twice a month. And he wants them to forge this narrative, which is the story of the book of Joshua. What happens in that study group, which is, my book chronicles, is fascinating on a lot of levels, but I'll mention one right here. In 1958, most of the documents that we have access to now, right, that have been declassified, these documents were not available to the public, right? So the kind of things, the, moral and political implications of what happened in that war and the displacement and exile of Palestinians, right? This was not like you couldn't go to the archive and get this. And so, the war lived in the Israeli psyche. And honestly, I'd say, in a lot of the psyche of world Jewry and beyond is this kind of like mythic event. And Ben-Gurion adds to that because, and again, the people who met at his study group weren't incidental. They were ministers, justices, members of the military, people in leading ranks of universities. And what they end up doing is actually not only coding 1948 in the language of Joshua, but they themselves don't have a vocabulary to discuss in a direct way what happened there and its implications. So they also are like working out what happened in 1948 and how to present it to the public in this narrative. And so in 1958, with the celebration of 10 years of Israel, this kind of becomes the public narrative. And the way in which, and there's still remnants of this today, and I'll even admit, this was part and parcel of my own education. So that a lot of this book was me like disentangling what was 1948 and what was the book of Joshua and why in my mind were they so fused. And so this kind of like mythic, legendary, justifying move of publicly disseminating the narrative of 1948 gets coded in this modern day interpretation of the biblical story.
Indeed. And how, now moving a bit forward, how has the lives of Palestinians been impacted by these interpretations of the book of Joshua, and how does it help us understand what has been happening to them through the occupation?
Yes. Yes. For Palestinians, this narrative is just pure horror, because what is implied here, right? If the Israel Defense Forces is a modern day incarnation of Joshua's army, then that creates this violent typology in which Palestinians are the Canaanites. And so to create a modern political interpretation that takes the book of Joshua, not only literally, but is applicable to the present, I mean, the true implications of that are horrific, because then the book of Joshua justifies expulsion, dispossession, and extermination. And it is so disturbing. Many modern day Jewish theologians and philosophers have taken a stance for this reason against the book of Joshua, right? There's kind of, different stories about thinkers who apparently like stapled the book of Joshua shut in their Bibles. A famous essay that comes out by S. Yizhar, an author that's against Joshua. So speaking against Joshua also becomes a way of inveighing against the occupation. But here, it doesn't matter that people spoke against it. Let's focus on the consequences here, because this projection of reliving a biblical reality, and not just any biblical reality, the biblical reality of conquest, justifies the conquest on the one hand and helps to rally Christian supporters. I have, spoken with, quite a few Christian interpreters, and, this like rise, late 20th century, 21st century rise of the book of Joshua it's not only the case in Israel and among, growing group of Jewish fundamentalists, it's also become more and more central to Christian fundamentalism and providing a kind of scriptural justification for militarism. But again, going back to the issue at hand, I mean, think about what then becomes permissible if you take, modern day people, as well as like your modern day political opponents, and you see them, as a contemporary form of Canaanite, then what is allowed through this equation, is no less than the whole horrific project of expulsion, dispossession, and, even these attempts at extermination.
It is a very, it's a very grim area to think about the way in which these sorts of biblical narratives have been used in this way. And it's not just obviously the book of Joshua. As after October 7th, we had Netanyahu go on TV and effectively describe the Palestinians as Amalek, which is another old favorite way of referring to Palestinians. Which, there doesn't seem to be a shortage of biblical vocabulary that can be thrown at Palestinians, isn't there?
It's really, really true. And let's start with what really matters, and then we can look at the historical trajectory. The danger of throwing these titles at people is that it casts, it casts the present, in some kind of like mythic space. And by placing it in this mythic space of like endless war, eternal enmity, it somehow accuses people of ancient crimes to which they have no connection. So in other words, like placing, any of this in a religious arena is a rhetorical and political move that should be shut down at every moment. And, But Israeli leaders, know that they, to large part have gotten what they've gotten by citing the Bible to Christian countries, right? It's a kind of a move that has allowed, or enabled Jewish sovereignty, but then at the same time, grafted in, right, this horrific alleged opposition, whether it's Amalek or Canaanites, that if you actually sit with the biblical text, wasn't even so absolute. So it's like fragmentary and a really horrible projection. And we do want to say that there's a lot of trajectories that collide when Netanyahu says something like that. And one is the use of the book of Joshua in the whole European colonial project, right? That, it was a little more literal in the case of Israel, but, this is something, a book that is used in different colonial projects, and it calls to mind, the Orientalist move of different excavators and surveyors and scholars, coming to Palestine and saying, oh, the people living here are simply a remnant, or like the Canaanites left over, or they're somehow, this relic of the past instead of being, fully formed people in their own place and time. Dehumanizing. That's the word I was looking for.
Dehumanizing indeed. But, and my last question is this, what do you see as this might be a bit of an odd kind of question because, it's a book about the past, effectively. What do you see as the future of the book of Joshua in Israel's occupation? Because you do also write, there are other possibilities that are open to us from these biblical narratives, which can actually dismantle many of the interpretations that have been put forward by Israel.
Yes, and I definitely want to end on the alternate possibilities. But, let me make one more point of the sort of danger of Joshua, right? Ben-Gurion brings Joshua into Israeli political life, and he puts something in motion in which, not every single Israeli politician ever by any means, but there's a trajectory of Israeli leaders trying to out Joshua the generation before. And when I say out Joshua, it's also coincides with an increase in militarism, a heightening of occupation, and the further restricting of Palestinian rights and freedoms and exercises of sovereignty. So, Moshe Dayan, 67, he conquers the West Bank. He, very literally claims that mantle. When the settler movement begins, they heighten the whole Joshua drama to an even more violent and literal level. The current finance minister in Israel, Bezalel Smotrich, he, at a number of recent conferences and policy gatherings, he literally cites the book of Joshua and interpretations of it, of what Israel's state policy should be. So I read Smotrich's stuff for the book. He was not in government then. I foresaw that this could get really worse. I didn't quite, foresee that he would be in, but we are at a Joshua apex of a disturbingly violent, oppressive, and truly, in the world of modern complexities, it's unacceptable what's going on. So we're at this kind of Joshua apex that coincides with the unfolding horrors of Gaza, and it's not incidental. I mean, it's like the worst thing to have predicted, that this could only get worse and to be where we are now in 2024. But I also don't want to cede the book to them. So, right, there's one possibility, and I put that in the book, of everybody just step out of the Joshua paradigm There's been a certain appeal to some Palestinian thinkers and politicians to be like, oh, okay, you're the Israelites of Joshua's era. Well, then we are the Canaanites, then we were here first. And I think, again, this whole typology is not productive, for figuring out really complex issues of, quite honestly, resource sharing and survival and polity. So, right, the one best solution is like, forget this book. Let's go back to like dropping it from the discourse and certainly expunging it from political discourse. And, if you're talking about a policy of trying, right, to exterminate people, dispossess them, and somehow like bring them to an end, don't talk to me in the language of Joshua. Say what your actual, real physical aims are. Put it in the bare, naked, violent language, that is a correct representation. So on the one hand, like, let's throw out the whole thing. However, if we are caught in this Joshua paradigm, then my call is to read to the second half of the book that has verses, right? For people who take this as divine writ or some kind of mandate, we'll read the second half. The second half says, until today, Jerusalem is divided. It shows this overlapping coexistence of many different kinds of people, and that, war and skirmish does not solve territorial contests. And in this second half of the book of Joshua, if we're in this paradigm, I really have my figure in one of the two female characters in the book. That is Achsa. She's understood to be the daughter of Caleb. And this is a non-Israelite but allied group that the book of Joshua puts around the Hebron area. And Achsa, right? Achsa and Caleb, these Kenizzites, they're called, like, represent this group that is, internal to the political workings of what's called Israel in the book of Joshua, right? But like, they're not ethnically homogenous. They're like another group that is under this same kind of political umbrella. And so I see in the second half of the book of Joshua this other paradigm for what can come after conquest is that, there's a kind of a fundamental denial at the root of the occupation, which is that there are not two, or, if we're more sociological about it, like many different groups already present in the land. And what we also know is that this is the region that is the hardest hit from accelerated climate change by way of rising temperatures, disappearing bodies of water, really, really intense questions about agricultural production. I mean, it is a very, very hard hit zone by climate change, as well as over 100 years of concerted militarism. So, okay, like all of this, violence and horror and rubble, tens of thousands of lost lives, this is all about a denial that, like, Israelis and Palestinians are already co-present and coexistent. And I mean, the level of trauma and grief, it seems, I don't think this is something that like can emerge easily, but like, how far is this denial that there's somehow like a contiguous nation there? Like, how far can it go? And so I do see in Joshua, if we do need to bring Holy Writ into the equation, I do see this model for the painful and contested project of what comes after occupation there in the second half of the book.
Rachel Havrelock, thank you for talking to us in MEMO Conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
To our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you've missed this one, or would like to catch up with previous Memo conversations, you can go to our website. But do tune in next time for more Memo conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.